We're always hearing about which countries are developed and which aren't. And for the longest time, the answer was pretty simple. You just looked at the money. But does having more money automatically mean it's a better country to live in? That's the huge question we're going to unpack today.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We'll kick things off with the old school way of measuring success. Then we'll get into why just counting cash doesn't really work. From there, we'll introduce a much more human-focused idea, break down what's inside it, see how it applies to India, and wrap it all up by figuring out what development actually means.
Okay, let's get right into it. For decades, if you wanted to know how a country was doing, there was really only one tool that mattered, and it was all about the economy.
And that tool is per capita income, or PCI. The math is super simple, right? You just take all the money a country makes in a year and divide it by the number of people living there. The whole idea was, hey, the higher the average income, the more developed the country must be. It was the go-to metric for a very, very long time.
But here's the catch. That one simple number can hide a ton of problems. It turns out if you only look at the average income, you can get a seriously warped view of what's actually happening on the ground.
Let's call it the billionaire problem. Just imagine a tiny country where one person suddenly becomes a billionaire. The country's average income is going to skyrocket. It looks like everyone's doing great, but in reality, the vast majority of people could be getting poorer. PCI has absolutely no way to tell you if that wealth is being shared or if the rich are just getting way, way richer. And it doesn't stop there. Think about the guns versus groceries problem. PCI doesn't care how a country makes its money. An economy that's booming because it's building new schools and hospitals looks exactly the same on paper as an economy that's booming because it's cranking out weapons. But for the people living there, what that money is spent on, well, that changes everything. And honestly, the list of flaws just goes on. PCI doesn't factor in hidden costs, like, say, polluting the environment to boost the economy. It completely ignores all the valuable work that doesn't come with a paycheck, like a parent raising a child. And it tells you nothing about critical things like human rights or personal freedoms. So if PCI is that flawed, what's the alternative? Well, this question led to a massive shift in thinking, a whole new way of looking at what it means for a country to progress, a much more human-centered view.
So back in 1990, the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, stepped up with a pretty revolutionary idea. They said, hey, what if we stop obsessing over the economy and start focusing on the actual people? And out of that idea, the Human Development Index, or HDI, was born. And this quote right here, it just perfectly captures the spirit of the HDI. The real goal of development shouldn't just be about making more money. It should be about expanding people's choices, not just what they can buy, but also their social, their cultural, and even their political freedoms.
So, you might be asking, how in the world do you measure something as big as human choices? Well, the HDI is pretty clever. It breaks it all down into 3 key parts of life. Let's get into it.
So the HDI is built on these 3 essential pillars. First, being able to live a long, healthy life. Second, having access to knowledge and education. And third, having enough resources for a decent standard of living. The whole point is if you have these 3 things, you have the basic building blocks to create a life you value.
And each of these pillars is measured with real data. For health, they look at life expectancy. For knowledge, they combine the average years adults have been in school with how many years we expect a kid starting school today to complete. And for standard of living, yeah, they still look at income, but with a really smart adjustment for something called purchasing power parity. It basically just answers the question, what can your money actually buy here? Because, $100 gets you a lot more in Mumbai than it does in Manhattan, and this adjustment accounts for that.
Now, this formula might look a little intense, but the idea behind it is brilliant. It takes all these totally different things, years of life, years of school, and dollars, and converts them into one single number for every country on a scale from 0 to 1. This is what lets us actually compare apples to apples when we look at different nations. Okay, so that's the theory, but let's see how this all plays out in the real world. We're going to take a look at the actual scorecard for India from the 2021-2022 Human Development Report. So the headline number is this. India ranked 132nd out of 189 countries. A score like that puts it right in the middle of the pack in what they call the medium human development category. It's a quick snapshot of where things stand. But the real story, I think, is in the journey over time. Look at this. From 1990 all the way to 2019, you can see this incredible, steady progress. The score just keeps climbing.
But then you also see this little dip in 2021, which the report says was mainly due to setbacks in life expectancy and education during that time.
And to put India's score into perspective, this comparison really helps. You can see that 0.633 is quite a bit higher than a country in the low development category, like its neighbor Pakistan. But you can also see there's still a really big gap to close to reach a very high development country like Switzerland.
So, what's the big takeaway for India? Well, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? There's been amazing, undeniable improvement over the last 3 decades. That's huge. But that recent dip is a clear warning sign. And it reminds us that there's still a long way to go to close the gap in health and education with the world's top-tier nations.
Okay, so let's zoom out. After looking at all of this, what have we really learned? What's the real meaning of development when you look past all the charts and numbers?
I think it really just boils down to this. The old way, per capita income, it's basically like looking at the size of a country's wallet. It tells you about its money. But the Human Development Index, it tries to do something much deeper. It tries to measure the well-being and the opportunities of the people actually living there. It's about people, not just profits.
And that kind of leaves us with one final big question to think about. If we agree that real development is all about giving people more choices, more freedom to live the kind of life they want to live, then what is the single most important choice that we need to make sure the next generation has?